Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We've been wanting to be here to talk with you about some very important things and projects and to provide as much information as we can and to hear any questions that you might have. My name is Patrice Horseman, and I am the Coconino County Supervisor for District 1, where we are right now, and it's been my great pleasure to work with so many of the county experts, the Forest Service, and so many other partners that you're going to hear from here today on work that we have done, not just on flood mitigation, and a lot of it, of course, is with the City of Flagstaff, but what we're going to be concentrating on here today is forest restoration. You know, I think all of us who've lived here, and I've lived here over 50 years, I know many of you have lived here for a long time as well. One of the things that we have learned is that we cannot continue this vicious cycle of catastrophic wildfire and post-wildfire flooding. We can't afford it physically, we can't afford it financially, and we can't afford it spiritually. What we in the county, what we've been working on, what we've been hearing from you on, is that we need to do something to change this cycle. The best thing we can do to change this cycle is landscape scale forest restoration. In the county, City of Flagstaff have been working with the Forest Service, and they are here tonight as well, to work on prioritizing where is the greatest risk and greatest need for us to do to mitigate the possibility of catastrophic wildfire and post-wildfire flooding. We have been working in Williams and Bill Williams Mountain. We've been working at the Upper Rio. What we're going to be concentrating and what you're going to be hearing on today is the work and the prioritization of the Upper Rio de Flag for forest restoration. There have been 6 areas that we have identified, and they'll go through this prioritization process with you and take a look at the modeling that has been done, which has really directed how we prioritize the work that needs to be done in the Upper Rio. Now, we know this is time-consuming and it's expensive. It's important for all of you to know that we are working together in partnership, not only with City of Flag, in the Forest Service, our federal partners. And it's going to be, quite frankly, something that we will be working on for at least the next 4 or 5 years and maybe even longer. So we hope that, again, we share information, we hear from you, we answer the questions, because we're all in this together, and only together are we going to get this done. So today, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time because I'm not the expert on all this, but we have a lot of people that are. But we are recording this. We're so glad to see so many of you here. For those of you that signed in and gave your email, we're going to follow up with a copy to the link of today's presentation. So please share it with your friends and your neighbors. And for those that couldn't be here today, there'll also be a link to this evening's presentation on our county website and on the Flood Control District website. So you can refer them there. Send them a copy of the link that you're going to receive after tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Flood Control District Director Extraordinaire and our Deputy County Manager, Lucinda Andriani, who I know you know and has been here so much through a lot of the emergencies that we've experienced. So Lucinda, I'm going to have you introduce the rest of the team.
All right, thank you, Patrice, and good evening. It's great to have everyone here. You know, this is, you know, I think one thing that I know I look to government to do is to look ahead and to invest in, you know, really assessing what are our risks and doing that scientifically and understanding what that risk is. And then, of course, particularly in this community, it isn't just about the science, that what are we going to do to prepare, right? And address that risk. And so we're here to talk about that tonight relative to the upper Rio de Flag watershed, which is you live in the Rio de Flag watershed. I think all of you are pretty well aware of that. So we're going to take a little bit of time. Now you will see here that, let me get to this. So it's pretty evident I am not Joe Loveridge with J. Fuller Hydrology. Unfortunately, Joe is sick, but we feel he made a good decision to not come and expose all of us. There's enough going around already. But Joe is the one who actually conducted what we call pre-fire, post-wildfire flooding study of the Upper Rio watershed. And we've had a long time relationship with J. Fuller. They did all the modeling post 2010 Schultz fire, the 2014 Slide fire, the 2019 Museum fire, and now the pipeline fire. And so we asked him, much like he had done for us with the Bill Williams Mountain that Patrice mentioned. He also did a study there looking at the risk. And so we asked him to do the similar study for the Upper Rio watershed, and so that we could really understand what is that risk, what are the potential impacts, and where would forest restoration be the most effective. So we're going to walk through a few of these slides here. I'm going to do kind of the overview piece, and then Jay Smith, our forest restoration director, is going to do the second part of Joe's presentation, which really gets into the actual study results specifically to this study. So this first slide just talks a little bit about what I shared with you. You know, why do we study post-wildfire impacts before the wildfire? And that's so that we know that the investments that we make in forest restoration are going to have the impact that we want to see, right? It's how to prioritize our investments. And we work very closely with the Forest Service on developing, those strategies and those priorities. But again, it's based on this science. The work in this arena goes back some time. In fact, in 2015, we were approached by FEMA after the work that we had done post-Schultz fire, and asked to if we would be interested in a grant to do an entire county assessment of potential for post-wildfire flooding. And we said, yes, we would be very interested in doing that. And we did. We conducted that study. And then we've funded since then these additional, more in-depth studies. But both the Upper Rio had been identified. We got the grant, I think, in 15, and then the results have come out, time frames after that, investing more to get more detail. But that was a very good investment. I was with the gentleman last week from FEMA, and I told him, he was sharing how impressed he is with what we've done, and I said, yeah, and it all started with a grant from FEMA. Thank you. So some of the things that we look at in this study, and again, Jay will get more into the details, but is, of course, we look at runoff processes, and we look at what affects the floodwater runoff processes. Of course, burn severity is key. And there was a lot of effort in this study to really look at the history of the fires we've had over the last, about 15 years now on the peaks, to really understand and look at the history of the progression of those fires and the severity of those fires, and apply those lessons learned to this study. So, and then relative to rainfall, you'll see back there on your way out, you can take a look at it. What we've come to now, based upon all the rain gauge data coming out of the Schultz fire, and then also the museum, frankly, this was before museum, is that this storm that's modeled, this 2-inch rainstorm in 45 minutes, has really proven to be a pretty likely scenario and one that can create a pretty significant impact. So that whole model process and calibrating the model has been really refined through what has been our experience, what has the gauge data told us, what's the gauge data telling us, and the regional fire history and those kinds of things. And developing those burn scenarios, working, again, Joe worked closely with the Forest Service to look at, you know, how would we expect these areas to burn? What might that look like? What are prevailing winds? Those types of things. So it's very specific to this area. So, you know, it might not be a bad idea if I put on the, trying to carry a lot here. So, you know, again, why study the impacts before a fire? I want to understand the risk. We want informed mitigation. And it's informing not only our forest restoration and the work that we would do in that arena, but also if this fire does occur, what are we going, we'll have the base modeling now is done, so we can very quickly develop plans to respond to that potential of flooding. So let me just put this on. I'm not going to put it up through, I'm just going to put it on. Yeah, let's just put it right there. Okay. Yeah, okay. Oh, that's right, this one's really tight. There it goes. Okay. Okay, how's that? That's a little better. Let me turn this off so we don't get any feedback. There we go. Okay. So, so it'll both, you know, our opportunity to respond much more quickly now is in place, and that certainly really helped us relative to pipeline on the east side, northeast side, those 8 watersheds that burned in pipeline because we had all the modeling and LIDAR, which is a way to better understand a lot of detail about the geography, topography already, so we're able to start modeling immediately. And so that's another set of reasons why we do this work. I think one thing to understand with this, but like any scientific modeling, there's always a lot of variability, right? And we could sit here and argue over the variables probably all night long. But at some point in a process, you have to agree to what is the level of variability you're going to assume and make some assumptions and move forward with the study, right? And you can see here the, you know, what are those variables? There, what are the variables? And so the data presented shows what could happen if a high severity fire occurs and monsoonal storms impact the burn area. And we've seen that, right? We've had fires and then not had, for 2 years we didn't, in museum, we didn't have monsoons. And then we had a very big year of monsoons, right? And so obviously there's variability on all these factors. So runoff processes. I think most of you are probably aware of this. You've heard a lot of this discussion went on with you post-pipeline, Schultz Creek discussions about soil structure and what happens, you know, when you get a very severe burn. It actually, in effect, kind of melts the soil and it aggregates and becomes what we call hydrophobic, and that creates a much more significant level of runoff. That will deteriorate over time, but certainly in the first couple of years that plays into it significantly. But you can see some of the discussion here about those processes. That heating of the soil is very damaging, of course, to the soil, and of course you lose all the duff, you lose all your cover. I think you're all pretty aware of what some of these landscapes, a lot of you've probably been up on the mountain and seen those steep slopes with basically no ground cover anymore, and you can see that they're already heavily eroded. I think we talked a little bit already about this 2-inch and 45-minute storm. Why have we selected that for the modeling, and how you can see here the graphs of some of the gauges and how that aligns with our experience, and why we use that as the model. Interesting, in post-pipeline, we still have not had this 2-hour, we had 45 major flood events in summer of 2022, if you look at all 9 watersheds. And I think the largest storm we had was a 10 to 15 year storm. So we still haven't seen this storm on that burn, which you all know still we had a lot of impact. Next slide really talks about this calibration process, and things like the saturation level of the watershed certainly has a big influence. We know at the beginning of a season, when the landscape is very dry, we see a less reactive watershed. As we go through the season, it becomes much more reactive. And you can see some of the information here that Joe shares, and the rainfall events and so forth here. So, and that timing, how long do we wait post-fire as well before we start getting flood events? That really more influences how quickly how much time do we have to mitigate, provide short-term mitigation. So, and then a big factor in post-wildfire flooding is the level of debris and sediment, because debris and sediment are our enemies. Because any infrastructure that you might have in your neighborhood, one, it was never designed for these level of flood flows. Two, it's not designed to manage the level of sediment that you have. So one of the focus areas for the district in the Schultz Creek watershed, which was the watershed that came into the west side of Flagstaff, Coconino Estates, and you're all well aware of that. Our focus was to construct measures upstream of the city detention basins to try to reduce that sediment and capture that sediment on forest, so that the rest of the system the city invested in downstream could effectively work. Right? It doesn't just instantly fill up with debris and sediment. So I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jay, who will get into the details of the study specifically for the peaks that was just done.
All right, thank you. Appreciate everybody being here. We're going to dive into some details of this study that Joe did with Jay Fuller. We model these and the burn severities to really mimic what we're seeing, not just what a science-based model looks like, because we've got models from across the West, but Joe actually looked at the pipeline, he looked at the tunnel fire, the Schultz fire, because we saw things that we hadn't seen before, like aspen stands completely burning up. Well, that usually is where you stop a fire, because when it gets into aspen, it's greener, it's wetter. We weren't seeing that in the pipeline fire, so we actually changed the models a little bit to reflect that, because we want them to be accurate as can be. So when we looked at this model on this side of the peaks, where there's a lot of aspen, we had to kind of play with it a little bit to make it be reflective of what we're seeing today. Then as we do this model, it really, what it does is, once you have the burn severity figured out, you know what the soil is going to be like and how it's going to react when it gets rain on it. And that then leads us into, what does the post-fire flood look like as it comes downstream? And then we use that information in multiple ways, and we're going to talk about some of the ways we do that. One of them is, how do we react in emergencies? So we have, for the Schultz fire and then the pipeline fire, we've put multiple gauges, and even on this side of the pipeline fire on Schultz Creek, we've put multiple rain gauges up that we monitor 24/7 during monsoon season so that we can alert people. You know, so we have thresholds that our engineers look at and say, if it rains this much in 15 minutes, send out that first alert. If it rains this much in 15 minutes, then send out this alert for further downstream. And so that's what helps us send out those rave alerts and to hit your phones and your wherever, emails, whatever. We don't have beepers anymore. Why I went beepers? I'm going old school there. And then one of the things we're looking at I'm going to talk about a little bit later is watershed restoration. Can we do work ahead of a fire? If we know we have a watershed that's already has some degradation in it, can we do some work in that watershed that would help if we do have a fire, and we always say if or when we have a fire, because we know we're going to have fires at some point. And so we want to be able to look at where can we do watershed restoration ahead of time. And then last, we really looked at where do we prioritize our forest restoration efforts. The dollars we're spending on the ground to reduce that wildfire risk and or severity, that's what we use these studies to help us do. So quickly, for a history lesson on wildfires in this area, is we've had several fires. The latest one on this side, so some of them date all the way back into the 30s and 40s. This little guy here, but this is the LaRue fire. Many of you may remember the LaRue fire in 2001, 1,100 acres, burned up into the wilderness, really basically in the wilderness. Started right on Weatherford Trail, or what is that called? Freeland Prairie, thank you. And burned up into the wilderness. So that's the one that we had that kind of showed us a little bit in the early 2000s of what we're going to expect. But then we get to the last 10 to 12 years from the Schultz fire, which was 15,000 acres, and then you can't even see it on the map because the pipeline fire basically burned the entire Schultz footprint, and then one more watershed in addition to that. And then we had the museum fire of 2,000 acres right here in the Dry Lake Hills and more around Mount Eldon, 2,000 acres. Then we had the tunnel fire in early 2022, which was one of the earliest. I remember a fire going and getting that large in June. Had never seen that before. Or April, sorry. June is the pipeline fire. And then we had the pipeline fire, which we all know started here, and we had the winds that drew it through Schultz Pass. You know, we came really close to the winds not doing that and driving it across, and we'd be having a much different conversation if that side of the peaks had burned in the pipeline fire. And that was a 26,500 acre fire. So why am I telling you all these acreages? Because here's what we studied. This is what Joe did in the fire modeling. So this is the burn severity modeling. This is what tells us we run mock fire through the watershed here with the prevailing winds that we normally get out of the southwest. And then it tells us where we can expect low severity, medium severity, and high severity. And that's just soil burn severity. So we know what's going to happen to the soil. We did three main scenarios, then a fourth scenario of burning the whole watershed. So scenario one, and this is kind of, we're going to talk about this in a minute. Scenario one, this is Highway 180 is this right here, so basically stays on 180, and then 180 kicks down. So we're looking at everything to the north and east of Highway 180. Burn scenario one, this is Fort Valley here. Snowball Road, I think, is right in here. Burn scenario two is that center section. Burn scenario three is the rest of Schultz Creek watershed burning. You can see a little light green line up here with hash. That's the wilderness boundary. So everything above that is up to the top of the peaks is wilderness. So obviously right in here, all this high burn severity, but you can really see once you get in the wilderness and those really steep slopes, that's where you get a lot of the high burn severity. So wilderness poses its own conundrums for us because you cannot take mechanized equipment into wilderness and treat wilderness acres. So what we're looking at doing right now is, as we talk about the forest restoration, is we're going to be focusing on everything below wilderness so that we can catch any fires before it gets to the wilderness. You'll notice in burn scenario 1, a lot of that real moderate, medium severity leading up into the high burn severity. So keep that in mind when we get to the forest restoration discussion. Another thing we wanted to really show and point out is, you know, we never know where the fire is going to start, whether it be human caused or lightning. We never know. That's why we broke it into these 3 scenarios, and the 4th scenario of everything burning. Burn scenario 1, if that whole area burned, is 10,700 acres. 2, this intersection, 6,800 acres, and 3, that smaller Schultz Creek watershed is 4,000 acres. But all in total is 21,500 acres. Then you add in well, that includes the wilderness, the 4,500 acres of wilderness. But if you think back to those fires we were just talking about, 21,000 acre fire is not that much of a fire. I mean, in today's world, we're seeing 300, 400, 500,000 acres. A 21,000, because some people think, the whole mountain's not going to burn. The whole mountain could easily burn. It would have burned up on the size of the pipeline fire if it had come this way. So the post-fire flood modeling, so we use those burn severities to then we put 2 inches of rain in 45 minutes on that whole area that burned, and we see what is the result. The models will take about 4 days to run. I mean, that computer is just running those models and all those numbers, and it tells us as it works its way, that water works its way down the system, and it tells us what are we going to see. So in the scenario 1, if we just burn that, you see that that's the red line in each of these. This is what kind of impact. So you have a 31% increase in flow. Is that times? Is that what that is? Okay. I wasn't sure he didn't have a listing on that. So 31 times increase of flow from just scenario 1 burning and getting 2 inches in 45 minutes. And then obviously that flow gets less as you move down into, so here then it goes to Cheshire, it's like 14 times. Once you get to Schultz Creek and into downtown. And the reason it doesn't affect Schultz Creek is because Schultz Creek didn't burn in that scenario, so it didn't really affect it. But downtown even sees an 8% increase in flow just from that one section, that burn scenario 1 burning and getting rained on. So it moves through this. Obviously scenario 4, which is the whole mountain burning, you get that high flush through Fort Valley, but it stays at 16% or 16 times increase into Cheshire, then Schultz Creek has an increase, and then you have a 12% increase in downtown of flow, water that's flowing through the area, or down the Rio. Another part of the study, what Joe did was looked at how deep will the water get. And then he also looked at what's the relative probability of an area getting wet in those rain events. So as we'll look, and you'll see it in that map back there, if you want to go look afterwards, and we'll look at it here also, but it shows how deep. So right in here, you see a 4 to 5 foot deep of water in Fort Valley on the whole mountain burning and getting that 2 inch in 45-minute rain. But then he also looks at what's the probability that this parcel here will get wet. Well, with the yellow is it gets wet when a wildfire covers the watershed that it's in and you get a large rain event. The darker you get, it's wet with any fire and with all rainfall events scenarios. So the red means you're basically, no matter what kind of fire we get up there and what kind of rainfall we get, it's going to get wet. Not to say it's going to flood deep, but it's going to see water. So this is the actual model results for Fort Valley. So you can see the flood depths, you can see where it hits 180 and starts to back up. And then it finally works its way through 180 and then goes into this natural, the Rio to Flag channel. That's basically the headwaters. And so you're seeing, over 5 feet in this one area, but you can see the parcels here, the little black dots are all homes. So you can see where homes are getting impacted in certain areas. So we know exactly where those homes that will be impacted. And it's amazing how accurate Joe gets with these models. When we had the museum flooding, when we had the pipeline flooding, I mean, we knew where to put sandbags after we saw the fire because we had these models. That's one of the things these models really help us with is how do we do mitigation post-fire? And then the probability of wetness after a burn in that watershed above them and in any kind of rain. So you can see the high probabilities for a lot of homes in certain areas. Then we get to Cheshire. So the Rio de Flag runs right through the middle of Cheshire here. It stays mostly in the channel, does pretty good. That's a pretty deep channel that they have through there, but it does come out and start to impact more some of the side streets than it does the homes, but it does impact a lot of the side streets going along the Rio de Flag as it leaks out this way and this way. And again, the probability, the purple line is the Rio de Flag channel, and then you see the probability as it moves out away from the Rio. And then the one you've all been waiting for, Coconino Estates. So again, you have the Rio de Flag coming through, Beale Street, Meade, and you start to see areas where we kind of know where those weak spots are, where the water's going to want to come out of the channel and come down into the neighborhoods or down the streets, which is usually, if we do have a fire and we start to do flood mitigation work, the immediate work that we do with sandbagging and jersey barriers and all that is we turn those roads into waterways so that they don't affect homes. They stay in the roadway. We did that with museum. Culvert at the fire station on 180 is up at the very, I can't reach it. Yeah, right by the H, the T and the H in depths. That's where it's at up there.
I don't believe that the modeling had been completed for that work that's in this study. But remember, that only really addresses what's coming off of Schultz Creek, not what's coming through Fort Valley and the other two areas.
Yeah, if it came through Cheshire and Fort Valley, it's going to come through Coconino Estates. The only thing the watershed that pipe alleviates or helps with is the Schultz Creek watershed.
Which will help, believe me.
Yeah.
It will help. The mitigation that we had post-Schultz after pipeline, even though the increases were, anywhere from 10 to 31 times, we saw tremendous benefit from that mitigation still.
But we could show you.
Didn't alleviate every problem, but it made a big difference.
But here's the comparison. This is the pipeline fire, so the Schultz Creek watershed burn. This was the fire modeling, so you saw, that, 1/2 to 1 foot right here on the road that's going along, and then you go, now we're at 2 to 3 feet. So doubled, tripled the depth because of all that higher up watersheds burning and flooding. So we know, the models give us a really good indication of what to expect if we have a wildfire that burns the whole mountain, the whole rest of that Rio de Flag watershed. Another thing we looked at was how many parcels then get affected. So we have, in scenario 1, just that furthest up, the one right above Fort Valley. If it burns and floods, we're going to have 1,600 homes approximately, or total parcels, 1,100 homes and 272 commercial buildings. But if the whole mountain burns, you can see the difference, how that grows to almost 2,200 parcels being affected in some way. Now, affected in some way means you may have a half an inch, or it could mean you have 3 feet, 4 feet, so
I think it starts at a half foot.
a half, yeah, 6
Yeah.
inches, that's right. Right, 6 inches.
It has to be at least half a foot.
Right.
And what really influences that is how high up is the entry of your home? Do you have a foundation that raises the home off the ground? Are you at ground level for the entry to your home? Those are the kinds of things that would influence whether 6 inches is going to have any impact or not, right?
So what did the study tell us? The study told us that the Rio de Flag watershed is at high risk for catastrophic wildfire. We saw that through the burn modeling, the wildfire modeling that Joe did. Also, it showed us that the Rio de Flag and the tributaries that run into it are at risk from severe and repetitive post-wildfire flooding. That's the thing that a lot of people don't think about. With a fire, the fire happens, you put the fire out, it's done. With post-fire flooding, you get the one rain, then you get the next rain, then you get however wet that monsoon season is, and it's just repetitive. It just keeps coming and coming and coming. And usually the watersheds get worse and worse degraded as those things, and they become even more fluid and bringing more water faster from that. So that's what we had to prove to ourselves scientifically, that that's what's going to happen, and so we've done that through the 2 modeling. But then it also leads us into what Lucinda was talking about. How do we now plan, and how do we mitigate that work? What do we need to do to try to stop this from happening, or not stop it, but at least reduce the risk? Because again, we know we will have fire in the future. We know we will have likely some post-fire flooding. What can we do to reduce that risk? So how do we do that? We do that by reducing the size of the wildfire, but we also do it by reducing the severity of the wildfire. And the best way, and this is looking at a lot of Ecological Restoration Institute at NAU, a lot of studies that they did, the best way to reduce the wildfire risk and the burn severity is to mechanically treat the forest, meaning you thin the forest out so there's less material out there to burn. You reduce that chance of the fire getting into the canopy, where it's much harder to put out and much harder to stop its progress. So we reduce the density of the trees back to a more natural state, but also by doing so, then you reduce that burn severity, how hot that fire gets, because this forest has evolved to have multiple fires coming through, 7 to 10 year intervals of fire, but we call them cool fires because they didn't have all that fuel out there to burn so hot. So they had grasses in between the pockets of trees. Now we have just solid trees, and the burn severity is much higher today than it was pre-European settlement. And then one of the things we also did was looked at this watershed restoration, another thing that we've kind of cutting edge look at. How do we go into areas and identify areas, and we'll talk about one of those areas that we identified that we want to do some pre-fire watershed restoration work, so that even if we do prescribed fire in this area, we know we'll have a reaction. Well, we want to reduce that reaction by doing some of this watershed restoration work. So you have, it's not in the main packet, but we put an extra sheet on your chair there. So after we finished, Joe finished his study of the fire modeling and the post-fire flooding, we gave all that data to the Northern Arizona University's Economic Policy Institute and said, okay, help us now determine how much would these scenarios cost the community, the region, in an economic impact. And so they did this true cost accounting. What did they look at? They looked at what does it cost to respond to and remediate the wildfire, then any evacuations from wildfire, how much Mexican spotted owl habitat are we going to lose to a wildfire? I mean, we have limited numbers of owl packs on that mountain, and I know Lucinda says all the time, but, you know, she wants her grandchildren to be able to experience and see Mexican spotted owl, and we burn this mountain off, we're not going to have very many owl packs left. Then they looked at the structure and content damage, not just from fire, but also from flooding, loss of property value, utility damage, interruption from the wildfire event from businesses, and then again from the flood events. What is the long-term recovery cost? What are we at right now for the Schultz or the pipeline fire? We're at over 150 million,
Well,
basically.
We'll end up spending well over 100 million.
Yeah, spending well over $100 million. So all of that was built into this. And then one thing we added this time that is some of the new science that we're looking at is what are the health costs? You know, what is the PTSD? When you have repetitive flood events, you know, you start to think every time that alarm goes off, every time you see the clouds build for monsoon. Remember how we used to all get excited about the clouds building in rain? You don't get that excitement after a fire. You get the fear. And so they built some of that cost into that as well. And here's the big numbers. The total economic impact to a wildfire, just in the scenario 1, where it burned the one watershed and you had a 2-inch and 45-minute rain event, is a $535 million economic impact. If the whole mountain burns, the whole 21,000 acres, and you have that 2-inch and 45-minute, you're at $2.8 billion regional economic impact. As comparison, the Schultz fire, these are actual costs. Went around because NAU Ecological Restoration Institute did a true cost analysis after the fire, 105 million up to 110 million, depending on what numbers you wanted to use for certain things. We did this same work on Bill Williams Mountain. If the mountain burned and we had the post-fire flooding, in today's dollars, we're at 462 million. On the lower end, up to 847 million. And then, obviously, we see the 535 up to 2.8 billion is what we're looking at if this mountain, this side of the upper Rio burns. All right, went through a lot of stuff. Let's stop for a second, answer any questions on this before Matt gets up and talks about what are we going to do about this now.
Folks, just note real quickly, if you do have a question, please allow Trinity to hand you a microphone so that your question shows up in the recording.
Right here.
I noticed that of the fires that were listed, 3 were lightning caused and all the others were human caused. And these areas are at high risk of catastrophic flooding and wildfire. So my question is, why don't they close the forest during the dry season so these human caused fires are less frequent and less deadly?
All right, you're doing exactly what Lucinda said that the government should be doing. You're looking ahead, and Matt McGrath is going to answer that
what
question
they're doing. Yeah.
in his presentation right after me here. He's going to address that comment, that question.
One cost you might add to your list is insurance. Flood insurance is a big factor.
Yep.
Yes.
What is the base flow that you multiply 30 times? What is that flow rate?
I mean, I think pre-fire, the flow rate is less than 100 CFS or something. I mean,
It's pretty low.
it's really, really low. I mean, it's like a trickle sometimes.
Well,
'cause
it's from-
these watersheds really don't react today.
Called complacent. They're
Yeah.
very complacent until we get a fire, right? We don't have a lot of surface water unless we get really, really big, snowfall, or we get some kind of monster, rainfall event.
And usually
Unless
those are-
there's a fire, and then we get these very responsive, watersheds. So,
I'm just wondering.
but
if
I
that-
know, my memory is, and we can get you and the details are online. The study is online, so you
Okay.
can go in and look at the detail.
Yeah.
But I know last week we had a set of federal people here, and my memory is the 2-inch storm from the whole, from all 3 scenarios. It's running 6,000 CFS plus.
Post-fire.
It coming into the neighborhoods. So post wildfire.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that's.
Yeah, the pre-wildfires, you barely get a trickle because the ground just absorbs it. One more.
What you're talking about right now.
Maybe if you could please wait for the microphone so that it's recording. We'll pick you up.
Oh, I'm not sure what I'm gonna say. but- I forgot. What you're talking about now is what would happen if nothing is done, right? Like with the mitigation that's been going on, like those retention basins and
So
that stuff out by,
the stuff that's been done so far has only been in reaction to the Schultz watershed, that portion that burned during the pipeline fire. What we're saying is,
is a
if
fairly
another
small
fire
portion.
happened that burned the rest of the watershed, this is what the reaction will be, which will now guide us into what do we do to help mitigate that and lower that risk. So some of this work has started, and Matt's going to talk about what we've done so far in the forest, and then I'm going to talk about what we're going to, as a flood control district, help the Forest Service do to do
more.
even more mitigation work.
So Jay, what we're seeing now is just on the west side of Flagstaff. This does not incorporate what's going to be done on the east side or anything like that?
In regards to,
Well,
This is-
the planning that we're seeing is specific to
correct,
the west
specific
side.
to the west side. Yeah, we're not including, because the east side stuff doesn't even affect Coconino Estates, any of the water
The
flooding.
upper Rio. This is specific to the upper Rio watershed that's on that western flank of the peaks, basically.
But they still have the possibilities of all the things that we're facing too.
Well, they've gone through
Yeah,
what we're trying to keep from happening over here. So if you want to go take a picture of what could this look like, your community look like if this mountain burns, just go to Timberline Wapaki and look and see what's going on there or what went on there. That's what will happen here if nothing gets done to reduce that wildfire risk and that severity.
And even that area that burned, like we saw with Pipeline, the reburn was very impactful. We still got, even though, it had burned, 12 years prior, we still saw a lot of severe burn. And there were new areas that burned in addition to that. But specifically to your question, we had 8 watersheds, the east side, that burned during the pipeline fire. We've mitigated 7 of those watersheds, and I say watersheds meaning not only the on forest but off forest. And we're in construction on the 8th right now, and we have 1 more to do. So, and that's largely a set of very large storm drain systems, 10 foot
Like taller than my hand right now.
diameter pipes that will carry, upwards of 1,800 to 2,200 cubic feet per second of water. They're massive pipes. One corridor, we have 3. We have 110 and a 6 and a small 6, and that running all the way from the forest boundary down to the Copeland Detention Facility. So, no, that they designed the systems here to only the Schultz Creek watershed, because that's all that was affecting this area. And frankly, a fairly small percent of Schultz Creek watershed, I can't remember the percentage off the top, but
20
it
to
was a
30%
fairly
of the
small amount. There's still a
watershed
pretty
burned.
significant amount of that watershed that could still burn.
Which is why you see a reaction from
Right,
that watershed
from that
here,
one
is 'cause
scenario.
70% of the watershed didn't burn during the pipeline, so we still have areas that could burn. And just so you know, I didn't go through, and I probably should have, just to show you in the burn modeling. So you see all this green area here, very low burn severity? Those are areas we've already treated. So that's what the reaction is from a burn severity model, that if you treat an area and reduce that tree density, you reduce the heat that created in a fire, and you start to see, that's why there's these straight lines, because that's what we treated too. So those are areas we've treated. We would love to see a lot of green, a lot more green on this map.
We need a lot
than-
more lime green up there. That's what this is all about.
Yeah, and that's what
Do you have a question?
kind of segues to Matt.
So I was kind of wondering, in the modeling portion of it, you're talking about burn severity. What factors are you actually working in your model as far as
Yep.
burn severity? Is
So
it
it's-
just
it's
vegetation, soil?
vegetation type,
Slope?
Slope, wind. So we usually
Soil
do
type,
these to a 97th
slope.
percentile. So like how hot, what's the temperature out that day, relative humidity, we burn it to where it's a hot fire. I mean, we don't want to go too small, like, oh, this is a good scenario fire. No, we want like kind of worst case scenario fire so that we know what are we working with, because lately that's all we've seen is worst case scenarios.
But
That's when the
it,
fires
but it
go.
reflects what the Forest Service has done a lot of analysis, and they worked very closely to really look at the landscape that's up there, the vegetation types, the slopes, et cetera, wind pattern. How severe will it burn? That's that severity map, picked all that up. So, but in terms of the flood modeling, there's a lot of factors that come into play as well, so.
Yeah, I actually had just a couple other questions. One was, in your model, as it gets down further into the residential area, are you modeling in permeability of the actual surfaces? Like it starts hitting streets and stuff and it's going to collect. Is that permeability?
There is some consideration of that, but it would cost us probably another $500,000 to actually model in all the infrastructure. So you use the LiDAR to really get the topography right, to go to the degree that you start modeling every infrastructure, every pipe, every ditch, that takes a lot of time. So it doesn't reflect that level, right? But
What
it
you saw
still
with
is
the highway-
pretty darn accurate. I think in more dense residential areas like this, it becomes more difficult to predict exactly what is going to happen. You get out in the areas where you have 1 acre, 2 acre parcels, you see the effects of the natural flow, and it's remarkably accurate. It's a little bit harder here because that water is deflecting off, there's harder surfaces, right?
And then I guess my last one is mitigation. Woman here brought up the fact of people in the woods, and are you modeling any? Typically, when people go out in the woods, they're going out there in their cars, they're setting up camps, whatever, and I'm sure he's probably
Matt has that data, and he's going to give it to you right
Okay.
now. He's got the data that justifies what they're doing as setting up from the Forest Service side, so.
Okay, I'll let it go.
So I'll turn it over to Matt McGrath. He's the district ranger for the Flagstaff Ranger District here on the Coconino National Forest.
Thank you, Jay.
I was doing the arrow, but
Okay.
either way.
Great, thanks. As Jay said, my name is Matt McGrath. I'm a district ranger here on the Flagstaff Ranger District on the Coconino National Forest. The Flagstaff District, for you, is about 850,000 acres, surrounds the city of Flagstaff. So anything that goes on your national forest near your house or anywhere that you go hang out, if it's great, please let me know and tell me we're doing a good job. And if it's not so good, that's me too, so we could talk about that. I think we've already heard a few questions there. Jay and Lucinda start with some really heavy stuff, and that's important. And then I get to come in with actually kind of some better news, because we've been working collaboratively with the Flood Control District, also the city, and got a lot of really good work done, especially over here on the west side when you look at along the 180 corridor. I want to start by talking about forest restoration. Jay has mentioned it a lot, and depending on who you talk to, you'll get a different answer of exactly what it is. My entire goal, my career, 98% of my work time and a remarkable amount of my personal time is spent thinking about this kind of stuff and trying to prevent uncharacteristic wildfire and post-fire flooding in our community. And so the reason that says uncharacteristic wildfire is, as Jay mentioned, most of the acres here, Northern Arizona was built to burn, okay? And most of the acres here, Ponderosa Pine Forest, should have low intensity to moderate intensity fire rolling through it every 7 to 10 years. Depending on who you ask, you'll get 3, 5, 7, 10, 12. But 7 to 10 is pretty reasonable time, right? And so we want that fire to roll through the landscape. The fire was doing that, and then we decided to put a city of like 140,000 people and a county like right there. So that's where our challenges come in. And then we excluded fire from the landscape for 50, 60, 70, 80 years. And that did a lot to interrupt the natural fire regime. And now we're spending a lot of time and money trying to get as close to natural as we can, given the way that we've changed the built environment and reduced the threat of catastrophic fire and flooding. There are 3 primary tools. I'm going to talk about all 3 of these things. One is mechanical treatment, which is timber harvest, commercial thinning, even hand thinning with chainsaw, so it's not necessarily the big equipment that you see, although most of what we're doing over here you'll see is large scale with big equipment. That is some work that we're doing right now, and then generally we plan out for several years, and we mentioned, I think Supervisor Horstman at the beginning mentioned we'll be working on this for several years. We've got plans from now and can pretty much lay out for you the next 4 or 5 years how things are going to look over here. Then prescribed fire, I want to talk a little bit about that. Generally, prescribed fire, as Jay mentioned, comes after mechanical treatment, so we reduce the big heavy fuels, then we come back through and we burn what's on the ground and the grass, reduce the fuels. Generally, that's to take the punch out of a wildfire when it does happen, a naturally occurring fire. And then also going to talk about, there's already been 2 people jumping ahead to the people management piece, which is a huge part and potentially the most challenging part of what we do on the National Forest. I always start by apologizing that the Flagstaff Ranger District is kind of oriented north-south, so anytime I give a presentation, the map looks terrible on like a screen like this. But just to give you an idea, you know where we are, the 2 freeways come together and you can figure it out. These colored acres are all of our timber projects going back a few years and going forward. So to give you an idea, doing a lot of work, especially southeast of town, now on the west side of town, and then not as much on the east side of town. That's not just because of Schultz and Tunnel and Pipeline. It's mostly because we get out into cinder country over there, and there's not a lot to do as you get into the cinders, but a little bit of work over there. And then I'm going to just take a little bit closer look to give you an idea of some of the work that's going on. And this is the southern part of the district. So you see, put some names in there. Flagstaff up top, Kachina Village, Mountain Air, KVM, Lower Lake Mary, and Munns Park. So a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last 5 years or so has been concentrated kind of south of Kachina, Mountain Air, and north of Munns Park, along the 700 road. If you're familiar with that, one of the main roads, it basically parallels the freeway. Anybody who's driven down to Phoenix in the last year or 2, you've seen a lot of work probably being done there. If you drove up last winter, you saw big machine piles on fire as we were burning the slash left over from that. So a lot of work's been going on down there while we've been planning and preparing for the work that we now have commenced in earnest in the last 6 months in the Upper Rio drainage. Then here on the north part of town, so you see Fort Valley, kind of everything centered. So the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project started around 2018 for real. Bond was a little bit before that. I got here in 2019, right as the main work on FWPP was getting started. The helicopter work that we were doing, some of the steep slope work, also the museum fire was right then. We have finished most of the work in the Mount Eldon Dry Lake Hills area, still doing a little bit there. And then as you see, we have a whole lot of projects. The colors don't matter, they're just roughly attached to years, but mostly just to show you the different size and scope of things. And so a lot of work scheduled over here, and then I'll get to another map up close, kind of zoom in a little bit and show you really some of the work. I'll thank Joe Lovrich, who is not here, and I will thank Joe also for not being here. When I heard he was not feeling well, I felt bad for him. Then he said, I'm not coming, and I felt good for myself because things are going around town, and I'm glad Joe didn't bring it here. But Joe, some of the maps that Jay was showing and Lucinda, Joe built, and I said, you're better at making maps than the Forest Service is. Hey, can you plot some of our timber projects on one of those 3D maps of yours? Because it really gives you an idea of, I mean, everybody here knows the topography and knows the peaks, but this gives you an idea of some of the main work that we're doing. So the inner Fort Valley, so Snowball Road is right up there, just to orient you, and some of the projects, the ones that are kind of hard to see here that are orange are some that have actually been going on for quite some time. Right now, A1 Mountain, both north and south, you see it's really that work has just started, timber removal there. We have up at Chimney Springs off the Freeland Prairie Road, started a couple weeks ago, some hand thinning. And so hand thinning is people with chainsaws, cutting trees, removing trees. A lot of times it goes to what we call the Wood for Life program, which either generally makes wood available to tribes to replace the coal that they no longer use to heat their homes once the mine closed. Also a lot of free use opportunities, especially over on the east side of town. We've had free use firewood opportunities for the community. Some of the Timberline Wapaki hazard tree work that we did after the tunnel fire, that wood has come full circle, and we've done some more reduction, and now people can use some of that wood again for firewood. But along Chimney Springs, that's the Freeland Prairie Road, which Jay mentioned. The fire started off the Freeland Prairie Road. Freeland Prairie features prominently in my people management discussion as well. So those are projects that are going on, and then up there you see Snowball Road. It's hard to tell, but there's a little sliver there that's not identified as a project because we did some work over the last 2 seasons along Snowball Road, about 200 feet on either side of the road. Doesn't necessarily seem like a lot, but on a good day, that's a lot. And so that was hand thinning work, and now there are a lot of piles up there, along small hand piles around this big, along Snowball Road that will probably go in and start burning as soon as we get the first good snow here. So when we do work like that, just to back up a little bit, when we do what I call that hand thinning work, trees are cut, the logs are taken away, and like branches and stuff that have absolutely no value or don't help people for firewood are generally left behind. That also happens on a larger scale when we're doing a large commercial timber project with heavy equipment. You see those big slash piles. That stuff has no value. Sometimes we pay to take it away, like we did up in Mount Eldon in the Dry Lake Hills. It's pretty expensive, but it's not going to burn in place there. But generally, we wait for good snow, and then we go in and we burn it. It costs almost nothing, minus the smoke impacts to the community. I'm not saying that's not nothing, but the financial cost of that, when we're talking about millions and millions of dollars, if we could save money by just burning the slash in place, it does a lot. But that Snowball Road work was done basically as a fuel break, using the road and using that 200 feet along the side of the road. If we have a 50-mile-an-hour day, wind day, it's kind of, to be honest with you, that's get out of the way for anybody, right? But if we're not having, I always think of the worst day possible. If we're having just a regular day and we have a firework through there, that 200 feet, one gives firefighters a safe place to get up on the road, and they don't have to worry really about burning up, but it gives them an opportunity to try to control that fire, as Jay said, before it gets higher up into the peaks and into the wilderness area. Jay showed a map of the fire history, and almost every one of those, you can see it starts here and it just rips like that, and that's due to, especially during fire season, 95% of the time we have a wind coming out of the southwest that just blows everything northeast. Then generally it hits Schultz Pass, it gets even faster, and then it whips over into Timberline, which is what you saw happen in both Tunnel and the pipeline fire. So this area, as you all know, just southwest of the peaks is our priority area, shared certainly with the flood control district and also the city of Flagstaff, even though the city limits don't come up this far, because burning up the rest of the peaks, even those 21,000 acres, Jay shared the catastrophic part of that, and that's where I said uncharacteristic or catastrophic fire is what we want to avoid. So over here, these projects, these different colored projects that I'll get into on the next slide, are work that we're doing right now or in the very, very, very near future. So actually, I'll go to the next map. It's not as cool looking because it's flat, but this gives you an idea. Fort Valley right here, so everything going north. So these are the big projects, and we worked with the flood control district to identify what are our priorities and what do we want to do. And so we came up with these 6 priority areas, and more than a ranked hierarchy, it was more of a what's ready to go now and what needs a little bit more work. And so the ones at the top were basically ready to go now, so we started with those. We started implementing those while we started planning for the additional projects. And you'll see Wing East, Hawk, Little Wing, Durfer, Wing West are ones that are already, those are the ones that are all there colored. I think Supervisor Horstman said we were trying to come out and do this in the spring. And the benefit of this not being able to be scheduled in the spring is that I got to update the current status, and it's awesome compared to what it was. Before, it was a lot of, we're going to start soon, I promise you, we're going to start soon, and we're going to contract that out. And it was a lot of future promises. But fortunately, over the last 6 months, we've made incredible progress with our partners in the Upper Rio drainage. So this Wing East, which is, I don't even know what color, yellowish on the screen, it always looks different where you are, is 2,500 acres. That work was awarded to Perkins Timber, which is a local contractor. Started maybe 3 months ago. As of last week, about 800 of the 2,500 acres were done. And that's a local contractor, does great work. It looks amazing if you have the chance to get up there along the 151 road, along Highway 180. That is what your Ponderosa Pine Forest should look like. It looks in some areas looks pretty thin, but that's what it should look like. And so that's what we're going for. That, and Jay will talk more about finances stuff, but that was basically the Forest Service and the Flood Control District splitting it down the middle. Because in that instance, one of the things we're doing there is we're cutting and removing timber. That's like a traditional timber sale. But then also in that area, I mentioned burning slash. We're paying somebody to take the slash away. So we get rid of it so we don't have to worry about having those piles out there. That can either go to biomass, it goes to firewood, goes wherever. I joke, it's not really a joke. Once the tree or the slash leaves the forest, I don't care what happens to it or where it goes, as long as it's no longer out on the forest. Ma'am?
2 questions.
Oh, hold on just a sec for the microphone.
Where are you?
Right in front of you.
Thank you. For the timber that's being cut, is that going out to Belmont, to that new lumber mill there? And is the timber that's being cut, are we getting paid for that lumber? Is the city being reimbursed for all the board feet that are going out?
Yes, so what happens on these, one, I don't believe it's going to the Belmont mill.
Perkins has his own mill.
Perkins has his own that he's doing, so it's not going to Belmont. Some other wood would be going there. So on these, it depends on the type of contract that we're using. So traditional timber sale, we get reimbursed for the value of the trees. And a lot of these, we do service contracts, and so our trees are not really valuable, right?
Yeah.
But they have a little bit of value. Say a log truck, when you see a log truck, say it's worth $100. If we do a traditional timber sale, and somebody cuts those trees and takes them away, they would pay $100. It goes to the United States Treasury, and it disappears into DC and all of this stuff, and eventually maybe some of it comes back here, I don't know. But also what we do is we also, instead of that now, not that it's not important as somebody who's paid by taxes, for the Treasury to have money, but instead what we do, we call it service contracts. And so instead of paying $100 for that timber, say they owe the government $100, so what they do is they do $100 worth of work in lieu of that. And oftentimes that work is removing biomass. It's removing the slash. Sometimes it could be fixing up a road or something like that, but almost exclusively in this area, it's don't give us the money, take more of that junk out of here and get rid of it. That's what we're doing with it.
So let's hold off on questions. Let's get through this,
Okay.
because I think a lot of questions will get answered. But
Sure.
what's really, really important to understand is there's virtually no value to any of this timber. That's what's really important to understand. If this work isn't subsidized by the federal government, the state government, and the county through its flood control district, it ain't happening, because there's so little value that, you know.
And I overstated it, saying
Yeah.
a log truck's worth $100. At one
Yeah.
point, it was worth like 10. I know that sounds ridiculous, but
And
ponderous.
frankly, we're getting a whole lot more money.
Yeah, the value is the
Whole
tree.
lot more money than
the tree
any
not
value we
being
could
there
ever
is certainly
get
the value.
in those subsidies, right?
But then, so then
Thankfully.
another benefit of removing those slash piles is, so normally in a timber sale, cut the timber, those slash piles remain. We have to wait about 2 years for them to really dry out. Then we have to wait for the right amount of snow. Over on this side of town, you can usually count on the snow. We have to wait for the right amount of snow. Then we get in there, we burn them, and generally most of it burns down. Then we wait another year for the grass to come back in, and then we go through with prescribed fire, trying to mimic that natural fire regime. So by removing those slash piles, we take like 2 to 3 years off of that process. So not only is there less risk of those piles burning in place or somebody setting one on fire because they're an idiot, it accelerates the entire time frame of our forest restoration plans. So,
And that's optimistic. There are a lot more piles you all have seen out there that have been out there a lot longer, because it's just a lot of work.
Yeah.
You know, it's a lot of ground to cover.
and that's why we're trying to minimize the number of piles so we
Yeah.
can catch up on all those old ones. So that yellow one, wing east, the purple is called Hawk. And then there are these 3 little parcels called Little Wing. We work a lot with partners also. In this instance, we're working with the Nature Conservancy, and they are doing that work. Basically, they are for lack of a better term, they're like the timber contractor, and then they subcontract a lot of the work. And the value in that is that as a partner, one, it's work that we're not, the Forest Service is not having to do, so we're freed up to do additional work, but also generally bring additional funds to the table. So the Nature Conservancy has Hawk Little Wing, that's under contract. You should start seeing trees coming out of there, depending on how severe the winter is, April, May, something like that. And then similarly there in that area, most of the slash, that biomass is also going to be removed. And the reason for that, it's hard to see, the main peaks right over here. But again, if you remember that southwest wind, it's just going to put the Hawk Little Wing and Wing East just point right at the peaks. And really, most of our fires, if they get started down in the lower country, whether they're human caused or lightning, and then they take off. So that's a great opportunity there for us. The next priorities, Durfur and Wing West. Durfur is that big red patch up top, kind of surrounds mostly the Arizona Nordic Village. Technically, that's not in the upper Rio drainage. The blue line is the upper Rio drainage, but a fire in Durfur is easily going to burn into the peaks, and it's going to impact the entire city. So the upper Rio drainage to me is more a state of mind than a particular line on the map. But Durfur, we're figuring out how to do that work. Probably going to wind up working with the National Forest Foundation, similar to the Nature Conservancy, so another partner organization who does a lot of the work for us and brings in additional funds. And then Wing West, which is this giant blob. That's Wing Mountain, and this is Wing West surrounding it. It's 4,800 acres. It's huge. There's actually a lot of big trees in there. That is going to be offered as a timber service contract, so that's one of those where somebody will cut the trees. They'll get a very little bit of value from that, and instead of giving us the money, they'll use that to work off, or they'll take slash off of the forest to save us some time and save us fewer piles. That is going to be advertised probably next Tuesday. But when I say advertise, so we prepare a timber sale, we offer it or advertise it, and then we get bids. When I got here 6 years ago, we would get like one bid, maybe, for most of our sales, and now a lot of times we get 5. And then those are evaluated based on the work they're going to do and the cost. So costs to the government, whether it's the Forest Service or the Flood Control District, go down with competition, go figure. And so the market that everybody here has been working to help develop, the Belmont Mill is part of that. The market, there are more operators here, and we know several that are very interested in that, so I'm looking forward to getting that. And then they'll probably get in there early next spring also. So a lot of it, winter, everybody has to kind of slow down. It's harder to get in there. You can tear things up with the snow and if it's melting and not completely frozen. But they'll get started out there in the spring. Also, as part of that, instead of a traditional timber sale, when we do these service type contracts, we can attach more specific timeframes to them. And so like for Wing East, they had to do 30% of the work in the first year. And then they had to do, I think, 25% in the second year, 20% in the third year. So the majority of the work had to get done. The traditional timber contract, they've got 5 years, and they often don't go in there until year 4. And that's because they're trying to run a business and they're scheduling things, but we don't have 4 years to wait for work to get done in the upper Rio. All right, a lot of this work, ideally we would have done it already. So attaching those timeframes to it is another benefit of using those particular contracts. 2 other projects quickly mentioned. This one is kind of the black crosshatch. It's called LaRue. It's basically the acres on both sides of Snowball Road, not that little hand thing I'm talking about. Those are really steep, rocky acres that we couldn't do like traditional ground-based logging, like relatively affordable logging. So we're doing an environmental analysis on that right now, working really closely with the Flood Control District. The challenge there is because it is so steep and rocky, it would be a repeat of what you saw in Mount Eldon, where it would be helicopter logging, which admittedly is wildly expensive. So it comes down to like the value of how worth each acre those are. Traditional, these service contracts, maybe we're paying $1,000 for an acre. That helicopter work would be $18,000, $20,000 an acre. So it is a huge difference, but working to identify that. But as this work in Wing East and Hawk gets done, the risk reduction every day to the San Francisco peaks, starting 4 months ago, every single day, I felt a little bit better about my life because the risk reduction to the peaks increases every single day. And then the last one, Fort Valley Experimental Forest, which everybody knows. Really, really thick and overgrown. Fort Valley Experimental Forest is kind of a little bit unique in there's, a dozen or more research projects in there, as you might expect with the name Experimental Forest. A lot of those are folks from NAU. Some of them go back like 70, 80, 90 years. And so I think nobody's really ever done much work in there because it's really difficult to figure out. They're not just like little square blocks. There's different, there's just research blocks all over. We're currently working through that right now. We actually have a field trip. We're going out there this week to look at it and figure out what we can do out there, both in the short term, in the near term, and then if we need to do another kind of environmental analysis process after we finish LaRue, we'll be going to look at the experimental forest. Altogether, those are about, ballpark 15,000 acres. And the real work started 4 months ago, and it's going to continue for 3 years. And so feel really good about that. We're in really good shape when it comes to our our restoration work. I want to talk just a little bit about prescribed fire. It's one of the things we hear a lot about. It's less about the fire, it's more about the smoke. We get a lot more, I'll say, complaints about our prescribed fire program than we do about any of our thinning projects, because we talk to people and we say, this is what a forest should look like, and they get it, and they're not necessarily negatively impacted by a log truck driving away. Everybody is negatively impacted by smoke in the air. We understand that, I understand that, but it's something, as we talked about, these acres need to burn every 7 to 10 years, and if we try to delay it or if we try to stop it, it's just going to make things worse in the long run. Forest Service has learned that lesson 1,000 times over since late 1950, all across the West, and we're trying to dig ourselves out of that hole. But prescribed fire, so the idea there is to introduce low or moderate intensity fire under favorable conditions. Favorable conditions are like not June or July, essentially, is what I'm getting at there, right? And so favorable conditions, the goal of reducing fuels, as Jay mentioned, and then what that does is, one, it takes the punch out of a fire. When a wildfire comes through, there's less fuel to burn. It can't get as hot. It can't the soil, or the burn severity is going to be probably not quite as severe, which leads to less flooding. It leaves more soil on the ground, less flooding. And then, so when we have a fire in June or July before the monsoon, we have a better chance to suppress that fire and prevent more catastrophic conditions. This is a fire called, just named Wild Bill, excuse me. It's in the Upper Rio watershed. It's on the west side of 180. We did a lot of burning out there over the last 2 years. And there is an opportunity, or I had mentioned earlier, a lot of times we do thinning first, then prescribed fire. There is where we actually flipped it, because we can only do so much commercial thinning at one time. There's only so many loggers in town, right? So there we actually went in and we burned those acres first to reduce the fuels. We'll go in a few years after the more priority areas are done, priority being the other side of 180, and then we'll go in there and thin. So generally we do thinning, then prescribed fire, but we sometimes can flip it right there. And this is taken from the parking lot up there. And so when you see a column like this, I mean, if people don't know it's coming, it's scary. This is actually what it's supposed to look like when we have a lot of fuel on the ground. You get kind of a little bit darker, heavier column of smoke. And then one of the things that I find, people think that we just like make it up as we go. Like I wake up on a Monday morning, I'm like, hey, let's go have a fire out here. And that is not how it works. I'm going to take this opportunity to explain that. But we have burn plans. We have like prescribed fire plans. I have a sample of the map up ahead that I'll show you. But for the next 5 years, we love 5-year plans. We kind of work in 5-year plans. Year 1 and 2 are pretty firm. Year 3 is all right. And then 4 and 5, 4 and 5 just change as you go. Somehow what you said you're going to do in year 4, when you get to year 3, it's still in year 4. You're always kind of replacing things. But we have these burn plans that identify or prescribe, since you hear us talk about prescribed fire, best conditions to achieve desired results. So what we have is, when we talk about a prescription, we have parameters that we have to meet. And so generally, like, it has to be a certain temperature, like 60 to 80 degrees. The relative humidity has to be between 15 and maybe 35. If it's below 15, it may burn too hot. If it's above 35, we wind up putting fuel on the ground and we just watch it fizzle out because it's wet. That actually happened on that Wild Bill. There was a snowdrift nearby, and we're like, oh, let's see if we can make this happen, and it couldn't. We were within that prescription, but we were pushing it because we wanted to try to reintroduce fire to that landscape. So it's really, it all depends. We had some plans this week, but last week actually it's been too hot and dry here, so we were out of prescription. Some of our fuels were too dry. So here you saw there was some burning down on the Mogollon Rim Ranger District down by Happy Jack. They were still within that prescription, but we weren't, so we sat out the last week. We got this rain and snow. It's probably going to bring our fuels back in prescription. Right now they're too wet. So here's another week where we won't be burning. So last week we couldn't, it was too dry. This week we can't because it's too wet. And then hopefully the week after that we'll get in there. It's supposed to be 70 and breezy and sunny this week, so it'll dry out a little bit, and you'll probably see us maybe doing some work next week. This was north of the peaks, not in the Upper Rio, but gives you an idea. You can see this is a early spring burn with the amount of snow that was still on the north side of Humphreys. So this is not the greatest map, but this is a work map from my fuels folks, and this is basically our plans for sort of last year and this year in terms of prescribed fire, what we're looking at. And so We are probably right here. That's Chimney Springs. That'll be next year. But this is that wild bill country that I was talking about. So Highway 180, all of that timber work I talked to you about is kind of right around here. So we're burning that. So we're reducing the fuels here and simultaneously reducing the fuels over here. So remember, that southwest wind just drives just about everything I do, trying to reduce the fuels over there. We got a lot of that work done. The last photo I showed you is that stuff north of the peaks. That's important, but very seldom do we have a south wind that would blow a fire there onto the peaks. So that's sort of like, we need fire on that landscape, but it's not a priority. So when everything else is too wet in the spring, we do some work out there. But then some of the more complex stuff. This is the Eldon Springs Road that goes up to Schultz Pass. This is called Weatherford or Timberline. This is a fence line of people's homes. Some of those homes burned in the tunnel fire. They have since been rebuilt. And we're looking to go in there. Actually, we were hoping to get in there on October 16th with prescribed fire to reduce the threat of another tunnel fire to the community. Too hot and dry, couldn't do it. So ideally, if we get, I'm like Goldilocks when it comes to the weather, I'm sorry, but it's like, did we get just the right amount of rain and snow in some places? Like we needed to get a little damp, but not too wet. If we get more snow, then we'll be knocked out for the season. I always look for the right word to describe that because I don't like to tell people that stuff I do is scary, but like there's risk involved in that. I recognize that, and like I'm the one who says, let's go do that, and it is the least exciting part of my job. I love my job, but stuff like that is the least exciting part. But work has to happen. It has to get done. So we'll be in there hopefully this fall. Another one, pretty complex, Campbell Mesa stuff around here. Fewer homes right along the boundary, but a lot of infrastructure there. Then one of the big challenges that we have doing prescribed fire in this area is that there are the 2 freeways and the 2 U.S. highways. Like we're always impacting roads with smoke, not only people's lungs, but we disrupt travel patterns. If we close down the freeway with smoke, we hear about it. Jay talked about economic impacts, some of the ancillary impacts. Those are it. So. And then you see those crosshatch stuff, that's stuff that we got done last year. And then the red stuff on the far left, that wild bill we did this spring. So a lot of that work has been done. Also, maybe in next week, that blue stuff up towards the top is right around Kendrick Park, looking at getting in there. We're more concerned with the north side of town, but just to let you know, we're also working on the south part of town. A couple weeks ago, this is Mormon Lake Village right here, so we were doing some of that work, and that's risk reduction to the community of Mormon Lake Village. Not a lot of people live there, but those areas are very important to them, of course. So we were down there burning along Lake Mary Road to reduce that risk. And then a big one that we did in the spring, that big red blob right around there, is called 3 Echo. We have dumb names for things, but it's off the 3 Echo Road, so it's called 3 Echo. Got a lot of that work done. Some of that was along people's fence lines in Mountain Air, and it's like that's just the nature of what we're doing. So smoke is a hassle. I understand that. For some people, it is a kind of a life-altering thing. But what I say, and so I apologize, people say don't ruin fall color, don't ruin this, don't ruin that. These acres need fire. They need it under, what I say are better conditions than hot, dry, and windy. And so we're trying to do the best we can. And I think, was it last year or the year before, I think NAU had to cancel some of their athletic events because of one of our fires, too much smoke. Like, it happens, and that we definitely are trying to avoid. But again, it's just kind of one of the impacts or the necessary things from here living in town. Last thing I want to talk about, the people management stuff. I have been working for the Forest Service for almost 20 years. When I started, I went to grad school for recreation management, which is basically like a sociology degree, right? It's trying to get people to do what you want. In 20 years, I've still yet to figure out how to get people to do what I want. I'll preface it with that. Oftentimes, I think one of the unfair things people expect of me is that I'm going to be able to control people's behavior, and I can't. So we try to manage it, and I will say that. So we have surrounding the city of Flagstaff and adjacent communities, and we have for quite some time, an area that is closed to camping and campfires year-round. And that is this giant red blob here. We are in it right now. There's a couple reasons for that. One is nobody wants somebody setting up an RV city like on their fence line, right? that nobody wants that. I live over on the east side of town. Somebody tried to move in the alley behind my house. I didn't like that either, so we understand that. There are some elements of that. I will say, though, that is symbolic of some people have no better options, right? So we're dealing with some issues there around that. But that is mostly to keep folks from setting up shop, living adjacent to people's homes, and also from having fires in the most sensitive areas. One of the things I found is that people, if they're camping, sometimes they just can't resist having a campfire, right? They just can't resist, even if we're in stage 1 or stage 2 fire restrictions, which prohibit campfires. It is really hard to keep people from camping in places. Like most other areas of the forest, there's a 14-day stay limit. It's really hard to enforce that. This is going to sound ridiculous, but if we take somebody to court for that and they say, I left on day 6 and I came back on day 7, the judge will say, well, you can't prove they were there for 14 days, and I know that's ridiculous, but that is the nature of what we do. It is much easier to have a no camping area, and if somebody's camping there for a second, you could say, get out of here or be cited for it. And that is really one of the best ways that we have to reduce campfires. We had for a while an area that was camping was allowed, but campfires were prohibited, and both tunnel and pipeline started in those areas. Right? So that shows you we had, like people say, year-round fire restrictions. We have year-round fire restrictions around the city, and people just won't follow them, which then leads to the question about other strategies to manage people's behavior. People often do say, why don't you just close the forest? And I understand the sentiment, and the best way that I've come up to kind of describe trying to close the forest is imagine a 7-Eleven, right? 7-Eleven is open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. But if they had to close, they've got 2 doors with a lock, and they can turn out the lights and they can go home. I've got 600 doors, and a lot of them don't have locks, right? I've got 1,500 miles of roads on the district, and a lot of them don't have locks, and the ones that do, everybody that you know has a bolt cutter in their truck, right? They do. I have one too, but it's for emergencies. But like in the spring, when we close our roads for winter for the snow, which everybody understands for the most part, I get complaints about that too. When the snow melts, we try to keep the roads closed for like an extra 2 weeks to let them dry out. Because if we don't, people drive on them in a truck that weighs like 6,000 pounds. You get those giant ruts, then it dries, and those ruts are there for the next 6 years. Right? I have found in my 6 years here, we've got like 5 days after people decide the roads are clear before they start cutting the locks and going in, right? Absolutely true. So we've had roads closed for the flood mitigation work that's been done over on the east side. Tiffany Construction's been working there for a year and a half or longer. And we had all the roads left over from tunnel and pipeline were closed. At one point, they were replacing 1 lock a day on the same gate. Every night up the 6064D coming out of Timberline, somebody would go up there, they would cut the lock, and they would go about their business. Next day, the construction guys would come in, they would drive in, they would close the gate, they would put another lock on it, rinse and repeat. And then what happened, the only time that stopped was when we announced that in like 6 weeks, the roads are gonna open. And then somebody saw the finish line, they saw the end, and then they were able to control themselves a little bit better. Somebody still cut a couple other locks. But that is when I understand the sentiment, but it is really impossible for us to truly keep people out when people want to be in there. So that's what I share. But what we have done, something differently recently, we have really good statistics going back about 50 or 55 years on fire locations, fire causes, where they start, when they start, all over the Coconino National Forest. And in the interest of time, and even though I'm already probably going way too long, I don't have those slides in there, but it's really some interesting stuff. And so we've got really good data on where fires start. And after tunnel and pipeline, where they both started in areas that are close to campfires, right? We're like, okay, that's not working. We got to do something different. And we said, yeah, we could try to close the forest, but then everybody who walks their dog can't go in. Like there's a million people who aren't starting fires. Like it's kind of heavy-handed. We can try it if we have to. Crunch the data, 91% of our human-caused fires start within 500 feet of a road. And 500 feet doesn't sound like a lot, or it sounds like a lot. It's not really that much. Most of them are within 300 feet of a road. So people drive, and then they drive off the road, they set up their campsite, and they have a campfire there. 90 to 91% of our human-caused fires start within sight of a road. People, and I'm not blaming the cars, I'm blaming the people, but people go into these areas with vehicles, they either set up a camp or they don't, whatever they're doing, that's where the fires start. Do people climb up to the Saddle of Humphreys and start a fire up there? They do. I don't understand why. Like, we do have human-caused fires that are miles and a long walk away from a road. But for the majority of them, fires start near roads. So what we decided to try in 2023, 2 seasons ago, was we're calling it a pilot project, Stage 2 motorized restrictions. Folks who are probably familiar, we have Stage 1 campfire restrictions, then Stage 2, and it's based on, when it gets hot and dry. Stage 1, it's starting to get warm and dry. Stage 2, it's hot and dry. You can feel it, and everybody starts to get worried. And so that's when no fires are allowed anywhere on the forest. We can't even have chainsaws. We can't do commercial thinning operations. Everything gets shut down. And so we said, well, let's try something different. And what we came up with was, let's try closing all of the roads in these priority areas, and the San Francisco Peaks is the #1 priority area. Let's close the roads, keep the vehicles out. That'll, in theory, prevent 91% of the fires. And it'll still be open. The acres are open, your public lands are accessible, people can still go in there, and maybe then they won't cut the locks and drive in there if they can go to any of these trailheads, right? So it's a leap, right? But like I said, when we lock the gates for the winter, once it dries out, people are like, I'll give you a few days, Matt, but then I'm going in. When we close the forest and say nobody can go in there, one of the more interesting experiences of my career was after the public meeting for the tunnel fire, which was not great. And somebody came up to me and said, man, you really should close the forest. Tunnel fire, remember, was in April, and it snowed after the tunnel fire. It sleeted on the tunnel fire, right? We were not in fire restrictions. It was not dangerous. It was just some jerk that started a fire. He said, you should close the forest. Then without hesitation, he says to me, I'm still going to go in there, but you should close the forest. This is a true story, right? And these are the people that we're dealing with, right? He comes right up to me and says, don't let anybody in there, but I'm going to go in there anyway, right? And whether that he's going to sneak in, whether he's got his bolt cutter, I don't know. And so this was the best thing that we came up with. 1,500 miles of roads on the district. Not all roads are created equally. These are some of the best areas to get into. We would close 106 miles of them, which is 7%, and it would be tied to those Stage 2 restrictions. So when it's really hot, it's really dry, fuel moistures are really low, the potential for fire growth is there, we will close these roads. And you see all the roads that we close. Snowball Road would be open. People could get to the Arizona Trail, get to the Kachina Trail, get to Humphreys, get to Snowball. The road out to the Oldham Trailhead, people would be able to get to the Dry Lake Hills, and the road to Little Eldon Spring, and north of the peaks, the 418. People would still be able to access almost everywhere they wanted to get to, even if we had to close, even if we did this during leaf peeping season, you could still drive up Snowball Road and look at it, right? So we tried to strike that balance, and that's what we did. Turned out in 2023, we didn't go into Stage 2 restrictions. We didn't have to do it. That was awesome. This year, we went into Stage 2 restrictions only for 1 week, which is unusual. It was starting to get hot and dry. We were looking at the forecast. It was like, oh, it's probably going to rain in a week, but what if it doesn't? So we went ahead and went into Stage 2 restrictions. Then remember, this season was weird. It started raining like in May, and it just sort of, it wasn't a great monsoon, but it just sort of kept happening, and we never got into real big fire danger. So we did it for a week. A lot of people, told me I was part of a government conspiracy to control them, but it was only for a week, and then they got over it, right? And so when conditions warrant, this is what we're going to do. If things just got to the point, absolutely, where we just thought we had to close the forest or attempt to close the forest, we would still have that opportunity. It's called a Stage 3 restrictions. If things just get catastrophically warm and dry, that opportunity still exists. In my experience, people are still going to go in there, so we're trying to have this balance of where people can go in. Very few human-caused fires from a hiker or an equestrian or a mountain biker. It's happened before. In 2019, we had some questionable starts around Schultz Pass, so it can happen, but for the most part, we think that this will resolve most of the issues. And I believe that's the last one. So now we can do some questions. Or do you wanna
Let's
do-
finish up.
You
Let's
wanna do
finish
that?
up.
We just got a few more slides.
Even better.
Okay. So, yeah, no. Next thing we're going to do real quick is just go through, so what's the flood control district? What's the county doing about this in partnership with the Forest Service? But I also want to recognize Nicole Kennan's here from the Nature Conservancy. She came. I know she's got another engagement, so just want to get that recognition in that she's a program manager with the Nature Conservancy. They're going to be one of our main partners for that Hawk Little Wing project that Matt mentioned. So, as Matt was talking about, this isn't cheap work to do, especially when you start flying helicopters around with trees hanging underneath them that you don't usually see happening in Arizona. But what we are doing now, as we have identified the Upper Rio Flag watershed, is last fiscal year, or as we began this fiscal year, the district board of directors, which is our board of supervisors, which Patrice Horseman is the vice chair of right at the moment, they had set aside $2 million from our forest restoration budget to support the TNC's project with Hawk and Little Wing. We're going to be helping to pay for that biomass to get out and some of those acres treated in that most high priority area. And then we're going to be kind of shifting our priorities into that LaRue area that Matt spoke about that had the real rocky and steep slope. You know, those expensive dollars, those expensive acres, we're going to be focusing our some of my budget, the forest restoration budget, into those acres so that we can get those treated and reduce that risk. Currently, the flood control district gets about $10 million in tax revenue. I'm consuming around half of that for forest restoration because the threat is so high. We just have to get that because Lucinda talked about and Patrice talked about that cycle that we're getting into, this fire, then post-fire flooding, and we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on the post-fire flooding, and we have to break that cycle. So that's what we're trying to do. And if you want, we have a great website at coconino.az.gov with Upper Rio Restoration, and a lot of the information that you might look for, the studies and things are on that website. Another part that we are looking into, we applied for a grant and was not successful, but we're going to continue to work at, is looking at this proactive watershed restoration, going in, hopefully in conjunction with forest restoration, so that while we got equipment, while we got roads going in there to get the wood out, we can go in and do some of this. If we have a watershed that's already kind of been undercut and had some flow in it, we can go in and build some structures and try to reduce that flow, just to help make that watershed a little bit healthier in the case of a wildfire. This is one area that we did identify that would be a really good pilot project for us to look at this. This is the Hot Shot Meadow, so off of the snowball roads over this way, you come into the Hot Shot Meadow and the Hot Shot Ranch, and we were looking at areas to work, do different kinds of structures in that watershed and kind of rebuild that, what's called the alluvial fan. So as water's coming off the watershed, it spreads out, it drops all the sediment, it slows down. That's what we want to happen across the forest. And then another part of my position and what I do is also try to help this industry, because without industry, this work doesn't get done. That's why we've struggled for the last 20 years. In the 80s and 90s, we were getting a lot of acres treated. Unfortunately, we were still cutting some of the big trees. Now we've stopped cutting the old growth. We're only cutting, I think the average diameter of tree that we cut right now is about 12 inches. That's where it goes to there's not much value because you can't get much of a 12-inch tree. That's very limby, like our ponderosa pine. But just recently, last week, I think it was, 2 weeks ago,
2 weeks, yeah.
Restoration Forest Products, the mill that was mentioned in Belmont, opened the whole line. They've got both two sawmills running there, 2 lines of sawmills. They've got debark, they got everything running. They've got an engineered wood products line that's kind of bringing more value to our lumber. So they take a board that's got all these knots in it, and they cut small sections of a 8-foot or 10-foot log board. They cut them into 1, 2, whatever clear board they can get. Then they run them through this machine that finger joints the ends, glues them back together, and now you have an 8, 10, 12-foot long board that's all clear. They've cut all the knots out, and they can sell it for a higher value for molding and different things. So they have come in, they have invested $120 million for kind of ironic that they can do 120 million board feet a year. That's the equivalent of thinning about 29 to 30,000 acres of ponderosa pine forest in northern Arizona. Plus, we have a few other small sawmills, Perkins and Joe Dirt, other sawmills that are working in this area as well. So if you look at the investment that just industry alone and the partners like the Coconino County Flood Control District, TNC, National Forest Foundation, Salt River Project has done investments in Coconino County. The amount of money that's been invested by the Forest Service with the amount of money that has been invested by local industry and partners, for every dollar that the Forest Service has invested, we've invested $1.42. So we're doing our part. We're trying to get this done so that we don't have these huge catastrophic wildfires that impact so much of our communities. I think that was 2 weeks as well. I'm getting my weeks, too many meetings I've gone to. The state of Arizona signed a shared stewardship agreement with the USDA, the Forest Service, to be able to treat acres. They're up to about 42 or 40, almost 50,000 acres that they have what's called Good Neighbor Authority. So the state of Arizona has their Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management. They're going out and treating or overseeing treatments on federal land, which helps, again, Matt to be able to put his people out getting sales ready while they're overseeing the logging and thinning projects. The Nature Conservancy just signed their master stewardship agreement with the Forest Service, again, to do the same thing, to really help with that capacity issue, to be able to have Matt available to put his people getting sales ready and doing the work that they're required to do under law, and letting partners like the Nature Conservancy go out and oversee those projects, which is what we're thankful for, because I'm a one-man team. I need TNC to help as we're funding these projects to be able to do that. And so great partnerships, a lot of collaboration. I mean, it's something that takes some places years. If they ever get there, we're there. We're making progress. We're really getting a lot of acres, or going to be getting a lot of acres treated. So as you're driving up and down the highway, I always ask people that you're going to start seeing a lot of log trucks. Give them space. These things weigh 80,000 pounds. They don't stop on a dime. So if you're seeing these log trucks, one, don't get upset. Know that it's doing something to protect our communities. But two, just kind of give them the space that they need, because they're big trucks, weigh a lot of poundage, and you know, just for a safety thing. And they're all very safety conscious. They've got grandkids and kids. I mean, these truck drivers are really good. So did you have a few more slides that you wanted to go over, Lucinda?
I think that was it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think that was it. One point to make, too, on this biomass removal, a significant component in some of these areas, particularly the steep and rocky areas, is there's tremendous amount of dead and down. And it's when we see that dead and down that we get the particularly high severity burns. And so that's a lot what we're focusing on, is getting that material out of those areas. And we've seen the benefit. Bill Williams Mountain, where we've done some projects, we had a fire there last year before
2021.
And we've had a couple different times where fires have hit those areas. And one, the Forest Service was comfortable to actually put people up there to fight it. Before they weren't. And two, they were able to, put those fires out very quickly. So there's a balancing the act there in terms of the expense and everything. But some of these areas, we really don't have any choice, because if you leave that dead and down, it's just going to be a tinderbox anyway. So questions?
Questions?
Any questions? And thank you. Thank you.
Just a comment on the closures. The sign, like on Schultz Creek Road, is not a huge sign saying no camping, no fires. It doesn't even say that. It just has a circle and an X through it. And you could drive right by it and not even know it was there. So just keep an eye out for that. And then I've seen Chimney Springs Road already has a road around the gate, where there's a gate on Chimney Springs Road, like you were talking about.
Yeah.
People are just driving around it now, so keep an eye on that.
Yep.
So in terms of management, are we managing for recreation and watershed, or And we're not managing these areas around the peaks for lumber anymore, but it's more for watershed and recreation?
I'd say it's both, and the watershed involves a lot of timber work, like we were talking about. So we're doing for both things, and there's a lot more of the people management piece that we're talking about. There's a lot of layers to that, where, like you saw when I showed the map of the no camping, no campfire area. 2 years ago, we expanded that to include the road out to Chimney Springs, 164B road, which was the most popular, if you want to say it politely, non-recreational camping, or for folks who are unsheltered, or if you want to say homeless, that's where people would live. That is, on that part, with the southwest wind again, that's a dangerous area. So we added that to the no camping, no campfire area, so those folks now essentially live across the road, the highway on the 222 road, over towards the 171, which comes up from Belmont. So there's like those two roads where a lot of people are living. Yes, it is always illegal to live on the national forest. It is also very impossible for us to stop. What we have found there is that we have people in a relatively small area. It's easier to patrol. So they're still gonna be there for more than 14 days. However, we can drive somebody through there every hour or two during the more higher fire danger season, and that prevents people from having campfires. That's what we need to do.
Should I think the road, that area between north of 180 and east of 180 and east of Snowball Road should just be closed to camping and fires in perpetuity. Never allow, and that's the way it should stay.
It is.
That 164B and also the Freeland Prairie Road.
Yeah.
Both of those were added 2 years ago. So
Yeah.
Everything from Snowball Road and 180 south and east. And so the question then becomes, okay, what about on the other side of 180? And then the question becomes, okay, when do you go out to the Kaibab National Forest boundary? When do you go to, it's
At
just
least you
that
have a 180 fire break. So.
Yeah.
And we do not manage for timber. It's a management of fuels reduction. We're not in the business of cutting old growth trees. We're in the business of reducing the density of trees so that we can reduce those fuels.
I'm just going to say one more thing. I won't stop bugging everybody here. When you drive up Snowball Road and you see where it's been thinned, and then you see the seedlings coming in, and now those seedlings are about 4 feet tall. I know that's a timing issue, and you probably should have burned that area like 4 or 5 years ago. Same thing is happening at the Y. We have seedlings coming, and now they're 3 or 4 feet tall. And
So once it gets over this tall, like once it gets over 2 to 3 feet, fire's not going to get it. Then we have to go back and masticate it or send in a hot shot crew when they have an off day and just cut it all. And so that ideally is where we get to the 7 to 10 year natural fire regime, because that is how these acres have evolved. And so that's why those trees wouldn't grow. But we've been messing with these acres for a long time. So we're going to have to keep messing with them for a few more years until we can sort of get to that natural thing. But that regen is, it's just, it's huge.
a burning desire to go into those areas with clippers, like when they're 1 or 2 feet, and just go.
Yeah. Don't
Go
forget
for
to then
it.
pile it, though. You got to make piles.
We'd love
Yeah.
you, go
Yeah.
for it. Introduced by porcupine.
Porcupines, so she's saying, does that not have a little bit of effect with the healthier population of porcupines? And I haven't, back from when, in the 90s, we have a minuscule amount of porcupines than what we had in the 90s, affecting the trees and all. So I don't know if that area has seen a whole lot of porcupine. The two things we look at is porcupine damage and or mistletoe, and we have way more mistletoe than porcupine. That I think I've seen 2 in the last 10 years. Right, they're not doing that. What a porcupine does normally is clip the top out of a tree and eat the bark around and kills the top. But trees are pretty resilient. They'll just grow another top off the side and keep going. And then you have a weak tree that breaks in snow. So for some species, it is. For birds and different things, it is healthy for porcupines to be doing that. But it can also add a lot of fuels to the forest that, has to be taken care of with fire again.
This is probably the last question.
Okay.
This is for Matt. I'm wondering if the Forest Service does anything to so I understand that the need is massive and it's imminent that we need to work on this now and not put it off. At the same time, I worry that in our efforts to try to get this work done as efficiently and quickly as possible, that we are maybe prioritizing the use of this heavy mechanical equipment to do the thinning as opposed to having more ground crews and hand felling and potentially less damage to the forest over the long run. And I just wonder what you're doing in terms of your contract letting, or whether you are putting any kind of incentives into those contracts to encourage people to do things efficiently but with less damage to the forest floor, because it takes a long time for that to recover.
It does, and so generally we have to do the mechanical equipment, otherwise this work would take forever. But in some areas, like along Freeland Prairie Road, we are doing hand thinning. A lot of times that's because it's too rocky to get equipment in there. Same with the LaRue project we're talking about. It's really too rocky to get equipment in there. And so there are a lot of best management practices to prevent loggers from tearing things up when they're in there. Generally, we're pretty effective, not always, I admit that. But one of the best things, if we get a good winter and a good snowpack, and then they can operate on top of the snow, that's the absolute best thing for us. And over on this side of town, that's a little bit more reliable than, say, kind of the south of town, where it's a little bit more hit or miss. But it's a necessary thing to use the larger equipment, and we just try to. The ground's pretty resilient, and we close out roads. They need to have roads. We close them out afterwards. In a few years, if we do it right, it's hard to tell that they were ever there. 4 to 5 years. Not everywhere. Some areas don't look that good, I admit. I get the face. But in general, we're trying to do the best we can and balance things out, reduce the risk to the community while still preserving ecological function and scenic attractiveness as well as part of it.
I guess I would just encourage you to maybe build into some of your contracting work that as an additional incentive as far as selecting your contractors. Like, okay, maybe they're all going to do it at the same rate, but maybe there's one company that actually is going to make a little more effort to
So
not
elements
rip
of that do exist. It's not always just the low bidder. There is a history of how folks have operated here before and their ability, their known ability to do the work. And now, as Jay talked about, in the 80s and 90s, then we had a bit of a lull in the timber industry. When I got here, we were having bids go no sale or just one bidder. Well, then, you're going to take the one that you get, right? And now we have 4 or 5. The competition has increased, costs have gone down. I think the quality of work has, for the most part, increased as well. So we're seeing some other benefits there.
All right, well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for being here, and appreciate your questions and your time this evening. And we'll keep you informed, and please spread the word to your neighbors. Let them know what's going on. And this is being recorded, and thank you again. Thank you for your time.